Brindle hit the guard before anyone understood why. His snarl tore through the vow chamber like heavy cloth ripping on a nail. The one-eyed hound launched from Syrah's heel, all scarred shoulder and bared teeth, and slammed into a man in ceremonial bronze who had stepped half a pace out of line with the others. Metal rang against the vow stone as the guard stumbled. A narrow dagger skidded from his sleeve, turned once in the firelight, and stopped against Marcus's boot with a hard, scraping click. Sarah heard her own pulse in her ears, hard enough to blur the chanting priest's voice into a dull, broken rhythm. Marcus moved without flourish, caught the attacker by the throat, and drove him against the nearest pillar. Soot shook loose from the carved lintel and drifted down in black flecks. The guard clawed at Marcus's wrist. Brindle hung from the man's forearm, growling deep enough that Sarah could feel it in her teeth and sternum. "Stay back," Marcus said. Not loud, but the command cut across the chamber and held. Chancellor Ilion froze where he stood, codex clasped to his chest as if parchment could shield him from iron and panic. Tamsin swore under her breath from the witness rail, hands white around the oak bar. Sarah could smell rain blown in through the high slit windows, iron from blood, lamp oil, wet wool, and the sharp animal heat of Brindle's hide. The attacker coughed and spat red against stone. "No millgirl rules." Marcus pressed harder until the man's boots scraped helplessly. "You thought she would not be guarded," he said. "You thought wrong." Sarah stepped forward anyway. The blade on the floor had been aimed for Marcus. She saw that now by the angle, by where his chest had been a breath earlier, by the way the guard's empty hand still twitched toward the dropped hilt. But the words had been for her. No millgirl rules. Penalty bride. Collar. Not covenant. Every taunt from the hall had found a new mouth tonight. Brindle released the man only when Sarah snapped her fingers. Blood striped the dog's muzzle. He returned to her leg and leaned his shoulder against her calf, the way he had under banquet tables and through nights when she woke with fists clenched around old debts. "Continue," she said to the priest, voice rough but steady. The chamber did not breathe again for a long moment. Then the story's beginning snapped back over her like a winter cloak. The Salt Truce banquet opened in the throne hall in the year 1203. Under painted rafters that still showed smoke stains from older wars, sea salt lamps burned blue along the walls, and the blue light made everyone's faces look a little spectral, as if the hall had already decided to remember this night as a haunting. Long trestles bent under platters of white fish, black bread, preserved lemon, and bowls of cracked pepper that made the air sting. Servants moved in narrow lanes between benches, balancing steaming bowls with wrists wrapped in cloth against the heat. The dais rose above all of it on 3 broad steps of veined green stone, and at the center sat the vow stone itself, flat, pale, and worn smooth by generations of palms. Sarah Vale stood below the dais in a plain gray dress that had once been her mother's market dress before the cuffs were resewn to fit. The cloth sat too stiff where she had patched it. Flour had lived in those seams for years. Now it held hall dust and humiliation. She had stitched the hem herself by rushlight the previous night, and had not let her hands tremble until after she tied the last knot. She kept her shoulders level and her chin neither high nor low. Chancellor Ilion mounted the first step with his codex, opened to a ribbon-marked page, and read in a voice trained for courts and funerals. At ratification of truce, the claimant sovereign shall publicly select one consort under witness, pursuant to claim law, to bind household and border peace. Every spoon seemed to stop in midair. A cup tipped somewhere near the south wall and spilled wine over polished wood. No one reached to write it. Ilion turned a page slowly, as if savoring each scrape of parchment. For outstanding levy debt, amounting to 800 silver marks, said household stands forfeit to state remedy. Designation entered. Penalty bride. The word landed like rotten fruit dropped from height. A laugh came from somewhere down the lower benches, quickly strangled when nearby faces turned. Someone whispered mill rat. Someone else whispered debt stock. No one whispered quietly enough. Sarah kept her gaze fixed on the carved dragon tail at the edge of the dais and counted her breaths against the old panic that liked to seize her throat when a room decided what she was worth. She knew the debt figure because she had written it herself into the mill books year after year: principal, interest, penalties, revised grain levy during flood season, then revised again when drought took the lower fields. 800 silver marks looked abstract in a codex line. In family accounts it looked like wages delayed, seed not bought, roof slates left cracked through winter because grain came first. Brindle lay under the side table where she had been told animals were forbidden. No one had managed to move him. The hound pressed his flank against her ankle through the hanging cloth and breathed slowly, as if lending her his rhythm. Marcus Windrider sat above her in dark leather and iron, no crown, no jeweled collar, only a chain of office worn over a scarred breastplate. He had the stillness of a cliff face in sleet. He had not chosen a consort in 11 years, and everybody in that room knew it because everybody had a theory for why. Coldness, piety, hidden lover, curse, strategy, fear. Theories multiplied when facts were scarce. Ilion raised his hand toward Marcus. By law and witness, your claim. Marcus did not answer at once. He let the silence sharpen. His eyes came to Sarah and stayed there long enough for noise to drain from the hall. Her fingers tightened around the folded square of linen she used as a handkerchief until her knuckles ached. She hated that she felt heat rise across her throat. She hated more that he saw it. Brindle's claws clicked once on stone under the tablecloth. Marcus stood, stepped down from the dais and stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she could smell rain in his cloak and the metal tang of oiled armor. His hand lifted toward her wrist, then halted a handspan away as if an invisible wire had caught it. He lowered his hand. I will not take what is not offered, he said, and every person within hearing leaned forward because no one expected the war sovereign to speak softly. Sarah's jaw set so hard it hurt. Then stop the spectacle. Ilion interjected before Marcus could answer. Selection must be declared publicly, under codex, before truce seal. Declared, Marcus said without looking away from Sarah, is not the same as forced. The chancellor's mouth thinned. The law compels selection. The law also names refusal right, Sarah said. Ilion blinked. He had not expected the penalty bride to know the codex better than his apprentices, but she had copied columns of tariff law and levy exemption since she could hold reed pens steady. Before the mill seizure, she had kept her family books in tight, straight lines. Figures did not stop mattering because a person's dress changed. Rejection circle is permitted, Ilion admitted, reluctant as a man swallowing vinegar. At dawn. Sarah did not bow. Then at dawn. The hall exhaled in little bursts, half scandal and half appetite for what came next. Servants resumed moving. Cups lifted. People started talking again in clusters, pretending the interruption had been a legal technicality and not a crack through the center of the evening. Sarah turned before anyone could read her face too closely. Brindle slid out from under the table and followed at her knee. Behind her, Marcus returned to the dais. She did not look back, but she felt his attention like heat between shoulder blades all the way to the side door. The rejection circle lay in the inner court where old stones had sunk unevenly and moss grew in runes. Frost silvered the edges of the chalk line by first light. Witness benches filled early, eager as crows. Kitchen boys stood on overturned buckets near the rear wall for a better view until a steward cuffed them down. Brindle paced the perimeter with his tail high and one eye fixed on every moving hand. Ilion read the formula. Within circle, claimant may petition. Petitioned may refuse without blade challenge. Refusal recorded and binding until treaty term lapses. Marcus entered the ring first. Sarah followed, her shoes soaked through from thaw water in the cracks. She clasped her hands behind her back so no one would see the tremor in them. Breath clouded between them in pale, quick plumes. Ilion lifted the codex. Sovereign, state claim. Marcus faced Sarah. I ask that you stand beside me as consort. No ornament, no threat, no promise dressed as mercy. Sarah drew one breath through her nose and found the smell of wet stone, dog fur, and charcoal smoke from the kitchens. She raised her voice so the far benches could hear. Any forced claim is a collar, not a covenant. I refuse. A rustle moved through the crowd. Some looked shocked. Most looked delighted at fresh scandal. A few, older veterans by their sleeves, watched with narrowed eyes and said nothing at all. Ilion made a mark in wax on his tablet. Refusal witnessed. Treaty probation begins. 14 days. Marcus inclined his head to Sarah, not as sovereign to subject but as one fighter to another after a hard pass. Then, 14 days. He left the circle without touching her. She expected relief to flood in. Instead, her body stayed braced, as if waiting for a strike that never came. Brindle pushed his nose against her palm and snorted, impatient with human complications. At the edge of the court, Tamsin Reed intercepted her and yanked her behind a stack of split firewood before courtiers could swarm. Sarah's older sister smelled of oat dust and river mud and the cinnamon bark she chewed when she was angry. You made him bleed pride in front of all of them, Tamsin said, eyes bright. Good. I made myself useful to gossip, Sarah said. You made yourself unowned. Sarah leaned against the woodpile and closed her eyes for 3 breaths. For 14 days. 14 days is enough time to shift things if you keep pressing in the same place. Tamsin jerked her chin toward the hall. And if he tries force, I'll take his ear off with a mill hook. Please don't, Sarah said despite herself. I need your hands attached for grinding wheels. Tamsin barked a short laugh. Then keep breathing. Eat when food is put in front of you. Don't give Ilion the pleasure of watching you faint. Sarah opened her eyes. Stay near me in the hall when you can. Already planned it. Tamsin squinted at Brindle. And this beast stays. Anyone objects, they can try to move him themselves. Brindle yawned, showing every tooth, then leaned against Sarah's knee like agreement. By the second treaty day, Sarah had requisitioned access to the archive under seal and sat at a cedar desk with 3 ledgers stacked to her shoulder. Wax dripped from a candle onto the margin of the military claims register. Dust coated her tongue and settled in her lashes. She turned pages with dampened fingertips and logged every consort entry through years of famine and siege. The record was unambiguous. Last claim entered under Marcus's seal in 1192. No claim after. No substitutions. No hidden household in provincial accounts. She checked again in naval rolls, temple tithes, quartermaster disbursements, and palace domestic allocations for customary consort allowances. Nothing. She cross-referenced seal impressions against year ledgers to make sure no deputy had entered in his name. Nothing. 11 years of refusal were not rumor. They were ink. A veteran clerk with a missing ear shuffled by with armfuls of tablets. Sarah called after him. You served at North Pass? He eyed her gray dress, the debt patch at the cuff, the dog sprawled under her chair. Served and survived. Rare combination. Tell me about 1192. He set his tablets down with care, as if each held fragile bone. Bad winter. Border lords threatened to defect. Council demanded he secure alliance by claim. Whom did he claim? The clerk shook his head. Name sealed by temple order after death. The word tightened Sarah's throat. Death how? Childbed fever in spring. He rubbed his missing ear reflexively. I have seen coercive marriages produce funerals and anger, not stability. He broke chairs in this archive when the notice came. Then he swore no one again. Sarah stared at the lines of ink until they blurred. She pressed her thumb against the page seam to steady herself. Across the desk, Brindle lifted his head and thumped his tail once, sensing the shift. She did not stop there. On Treaty Day 3, she requested guard rosters from 1,192 and found the courier signatures. On Treaty Day 4, she checked temple memorial rolls and found one sealed entry tied to sovereign household with no public name, exactly as the clerk described. On Treaty Day 5, she compared council minutes and found motion after motion to reopen claim negotiations, each denied with Marcus's seal. That night, she found a second witness in the barracks kitchen, an older cavalry woman polishing a saddle buckle with ash and oil while stew simmered in dented pots. "I rode courier that year," the woman said. "Delivered condolence dispatch to him myself. He read it standing. Didn't sit for the rest of the watch. Next day, he sent back every marriage proposal unopened. Every one." The woman glanced at Sarah, frank and unsentimental. "He isn't kind. Don't mistake me. But he has not repeated that violence." Sarah accepted a tin cup of broth and warmed her hands around it. "Did counsel pressure him again?" "Constantly. In public and behind doors. He let them talk, then refused all the same." The cavalry woman nodded toward Brindle dozing by the stove. "Your hound snores louder than half my unit." "He pretends he's subtle," Sarah said. "Good judge of wrists, that one. I saw him stare down a captain this morning." Treaty Day breathed in and out through set rituals, midday councils, evening feasts no one enjoyed, nightly guard rotations that clattered past Sarah's chamber doors. She stopped sleeping full hours and started sleeping in slices, waking with the map of ceiling beams imprinted in her eyes. Sometimes she woke to Brindle shifting at the foot of her pallet and listened until his breathing settled again. On day 6, she sat in a side alcove while junior scribes copied tariff amendments and heard her own name used as if she were furniture. She stepped in, corrected their misquoted clause numbers from memory, and watched their ears go red. On day 7, she signed 3 procurement corrections for grain loss in coastal warehouses and returned them through official channels so no one could claim she overstepped authority she did not yet have. Every task became an argument for competence made in ink. On the 7th day, Ilion summoned her to witness codex recitation in the hall and made a point of repeating penalty bride with theatrical precision, as if legal diction washed insult clean. Sarah listened through the full article, waited until he took a breath to close the book, then stepped forward before he could move on. "Chancellor," she said, carrying her voice to the rear pillars, "you use that designation in this hall. You will retract it in this hall." Ilion blinked. "The term is statutory." "It is statutory in debt remedy schedules. It is not statutory as a mode of public address." She turned slightly so all could hear without shouting. "You know that because your own glosses separate fiscal designation from personal title." A murmur ran through the scribes' benches. Ilion lifted his chin. "You presume to instruct this court on codex interpretation?" "I presume to read." Sarah held out her hand. Page 212, margin marks in green, clarification edict after the Eastport petition. Ilion hesitated a fraction too long. Sarah saw it. So did everyone else. "Read it," she said. A younger scribe near the column flinched, then stepped forward with a copy volume, thumbed to the page and held it up with shaking hands. His voice cracked at first and then steadied as he read. "Designation shall bind account obligations only, and shall not stand as public form of address or ceremonial rank marker." The hall went still. Ilion's nostrils flared. The codex sat heavy in his hands, the leather dark where his fingers pressed. He could refuse and appear arbitrary, or comply and be cut by his own law in public. He cleared his throat. "By clarification edict under claim law, designation shall be financial only and not a mode of public address." He did not quite look at her. "The court withdraws the epithet." A hiss of surprise rippled through the benches. Tamsin, at the side rail, folded her arms and gave Sarah a look that meant, "That's my sister." Sarah held Ilion's eyes until he dropped them to the page. She stepped down from the dais without hurry. Brindle rose from where he had been pretending to sleep by the stair and followed at her left heel. As she passed the rear benches, a noblewoman in sea-green silk shifted aside to make room rather than forcing Sarah to squeeze past. It was a tiny motion. Sarah noticed it anyway. On Treaty Day 8, Sarah and Tamsin ate in the servants' passage between kitchens because it was the only corridor with enough quiet to hear themselves think. Tamsin sat on an overturned grain cask, boots muddy, hair braided tight against her scalp. "You look like you're counting in your sleep," Tamsin said. "I am. Claims, shipments, signatures, hostages, hours until this ends. Any gaps?" 2 tablets from winter convoy season are misfiled. One by mistake, one on purpose. Sarah tore bread into small pieces for Brindle, who accepted each gently despite his teeth. "I handed both to records guard with witness marks." Tamsin tilted her head. "You're already doing half a regent's work." "Doing work is easier than deciding what I want." Tamsin studied her for a long second. "Do you trust him?" Sarah looked at her hands. Ink in the cuticles, a small burn near the thumb from a lamp mishap, callus where she held reed pens too long. "I trust what I can verify. So far, what he said matches what records and veterans say." "That's not the same question." Sarah sighed. "No, it isn't." Tamsin reached down and rubbed Brindle's ear. "Whatever you choose it in your own name. Not because they cornered you, not because he looked at you like that at banquet." Sarah gave her a narrow look. "Like what?" "Like he forgot the rest of the room existed, and then got angry with himself about it." Sarah chewed in silence. Tamsin grinned, unrepentant. On the 9th night, the rain came hard enough to drum the palace roof like fists. Water ran down courtyard gargoyles and poured from dragon mouths into stone troughs. Sarah crossed the archive passage with a lantern in one hand and a satchel of copied entries in the other. Brindle padded ahead, nails ticking on wet flagstone, nose low, occasionally sneezing at drafts that carried old mold and lamp smoke. Marcus waited inside, alone by the map table, sleeves rolled to his forearms, hair damp from weather. A single torch burned in a bracket, throwing light over pinned campaign maps and stacked claim registers. "You have been in here every night," he said. "You have spies in your own archive?" "I have eyes." He nodded at the satchel. "You verified the ledgers." 11 years since last claim. Year 1192 entered under your seal." She set the satchel down deliberately. "You could have let rumor do your work. You waited while I checked. You said you trust numbers over speeches." He walked to the table's opposite edge but kept a respectful distance. "I wanted you to have your own proof." Lightning flashed white through the window slit and made map pins spark. Thunder followed, close enough to rattle a shelf. Sarah lifted her chin. "Why ask me now?" His jaw flexed once. "Because I have watched you hold your spine straight while this court throws mud. Because you learn law faster than men paid to quote it. Because when a child dropped a platter at banquet, you were the only one who knelt and helped pick up shards while nobles stepped around him. Because after Ilion tried to pin that epithet on you, you made him read his own correction out loud." He stopped, then added quieter. "Because I am tired of naming want as duty." She did not move. He said, "I do not need your obedience. I want you." The words struck harder than any shouted vow. Sarah felt heat along her neck again, infuriating and undeniable. Her pulse jumped at her wrist where she had imagined his hand on banquet night. She hated the involuntary betrayals of skin and breath. She hated more that they came with a dangerous relief. Brindle snorted and lay down between them, a furred boundary and bridge at once. Rain hammered the slate roof above, then softened for a moment before rising again. Sarah looked at Marcus's hands. Scar over the thumb web, callus across first knuckles, ink smudge at the side of one finger from handling too many documents for a man famous for swords. "If I step toward you," she said, "it is not because law cornered me. I know. If I step away, you do not follow." His answer came without lag. "I know that too." She reached for the satchel and found her fingers unsteady. "Then we keep to 14 days." We keep to 14 days. She should have left immediately. Instead, she stood a heartbeat longer than necessary while thunder rolled away across the palace roofs. Marcus stayed where he was. Brindle rose, shook rain scent from his coat though he was dry, and pressed his head briefly against Sarah's thigh before moving toward the door. She took the exit that gesture offered. In the corridor, she leaned her forehead against cool stone and breathed until her pulse came down. By Treaty Day 10, practical labor accelerated. Sarah was assigned to prepare witness packets for the hostage exchange and found that half the tablets had mismatched names due to phonetic spelling across dialects. She spent 2 hours reconciling households line by line with border clerks who resented correction until she read each village marker and kin tie back to them from memory. "Who taught you to do this?" one clerk finally asked, rubbing wax from his thumb. "My father taught me to keep grain accounts before I could reach the top shelf," Sarah said. "Debt taught the rest." Brindle slept under the table until someone raised their voice, then opened his one good eye and stared without blinking until the room quieted. On day 11, the hall smelled less like feasting and more like waiting. Even musicians played quieter pieces as if loud joy might crack the truce shell. Sarah sat at a side table with handover tablets laid in paired stacks, each marked by district and household seal. Representatives from both border factions entered one by one, each pressing seals into wax with bruised thumbs and impatient sighs. 37 hostages were listed by name and household and crossed out as they returned through the west gate. Sarah watched each tablet pass to witness hands, then to Ilion, then to Marcus. She counted silently as discipline against nerves. By 21, her shoulders began to unclench. By 30, she let herself believe this part might hold. At transfer 16, a boy with a split lip refused to release the guard's sleeve until his aunt showed him her signet ring and old lullaby knot bracelet. At transfer 24, twin girls clung to each other so tightly their knuckles blanched, then loosened only when a grandmother wrapped both in one shawl. At transfer 37, a mother from the Marsh district fell to her knees and kissed the hem of her son's coat. The boy stood rigid for a breath, then folded around her like someone remembering where home lived. The hall went quiet in a different way, not ceremonial, simply human. Marcus signed the final release tablet and slid it to Sarah. "Audit," he said. She read, checked seals against master impressions, and nodded. "Count holds." Ilion sniffed. "Even a mill ledger keeper can recognize numbers." Sarah set the tablet down slowly. "The numbers remain the same whether I read them or you do." Marcus's gaze sharpened toward Ilion, warning plain. The Chancellor looked away first, busying himself with codex ties that did not need adjusting. After the handover, Tamsin found Sarah near the kitchen door and shoved a heel of warm bread into her hand. "Eat. Your cheeks have gone hollow." Sarah obeyed, tearing bread with her teeth while steam warmed her face. Tamsin watched with that old older sister squint that could detect lies through walls. "You're changing your mind," Tamsin said. "I'm changing my fear's shape." "About him?" "About all of it." Sarah swallowed and wiped crumbs from her thumb. "He asked. He waited. He took no shortcuts. That matters." "It does." Tamsin's voice gentled unexpectedly. "So does what you want when no one is staring." Sarah looked past her sister at the hall, where witness benches emptied and servants hauled away platters. "I'm trying to hear my own answer under everyone else's." Tamsin bumped her shoulder. "Then listen with the part of you that never accepted bad grain weights or bad math. It kept us alive." Sarah nodded. Brindle nosed her hand for another piece of bread and got one. Treaty Day 12 and 13 passed with less ceremony and more paper than anyone expected for the final stretch. Sarah and 3 scribes sat at a long table near a window slit and copied revised truce clauses until their wrists cramped. Tariff rates, bridge toll exemptions, shared river dredging obligations, winter convoy timing, penalties for unlawful seizure. Marcus entered twice to review Border Patrol language and accepted Sarah's amendments without performance. When one clause still allowed discretionary detention of debtor households at local gates, Sarah struck through it and replaced it with a fixed appeals procedure requiring written cause and witness seal within 2 days. Ilion objected. She quoted his own precedent from a famine year appeal and watched him realize she had read not only statute but old petitions. At dusk on day 13, she and Marcus reviewed final packets in the smaller council room while Brindle slept under the bench with his paws twitching in dreams. "If we pass this wording," Marcus said, tapping one line, "Northern lords will claim loss of autonomy." "If we don't pass it," Sarah replied, "they can continue hiding seizure behind custom." She slid him a second tablet. "Compromise here. Local review first, central appeal second, both documented." He read, then nodded once. Accepted. She was still getting used to that simple response. No theatrics, no withheld concession as favor. Agreement when she made a better case. When she left the room, she found Tamsin waiting in the corridor with 2 mugs of watered ale. "Tomorrow," Tamsin said. "Tomorrow," Sarah echoed. They drank in silence for a while. Brindle lay between them, snoring with his lip caught on one tooth, entirely unimpressed by politics. On the 14th day, dawn came cold and bright, sky washed hard blue after night rain. The throne hall had been stripped for the final rite. No feast tables, only witness benches, banners tied back, and the restored dais cleaned until green stone shone wetly. Priests set bowls of salted water at each stair corner. Incense burned in thin, pale streams that smelled of cedar and bitter resin. Brindle paced ahead of Sarah, hackles lifting and settling with each new scent. Sarah wore dark wool this time, not the gray patch dress from banquet night. The cuffs were still plain, but the cloth fit her shoulders properly and did not borrow shape from old grief. Ilion stood at the foot of the dais in full ceremonial robe, codex chain across his chest. His face looked carved from tallow and disapproval. "By probation complete," he recited, "petition may be renewed before witness and consummation sealed after vowstone assent. Vow cannot be unmade." The phrase sat heavy in the air. Cannot be unmade. Marcus waited beside the stone in formal war coat without weapons, palms open. No sword at his hip, no dagger at boot. Stripped down to consent and risk. Sarah noticed details because details kept panic from taking root. The worn edge of his cuff, the rain-dark seam at one shoulder, a thread loose near the clasp. The shallow scar along his jaw she had not seen clearly before. Ilion turned to Sarah. "Petitioned. Step if willing." Brindle gave a low rumble toward the right guardrail. Sarah glanced that way. Bronze-helmed guards stood in line, rigid and blank, halberds grounded. One man near the pillar held his shoulders too high, breath too fast, eyes not on the right but fixed on Marcus's chest. Brindle's growl deepened. The next heartbeat was violence. The guard broke rank, sleeve jerking. Steel flashed. Brindle launched. The chamber exploded into shouts and boots. The dagger clattered. Marcus moved, caught the attacker, slammed him to stone. Sarah felt wind from the motion brush her face. She did not scream. Her body went taut as bow wood, every sense sharpened. Blood bead on Marcus's knuckle, sandalwood smoke from the nearest torch. The attacker's rasped curse against mill girl. "Hold him!" Marcus barked. 2 guards surged in and wrenched the man's arms behind his back. Ilion had gone gray. The codex shook in his grip. Tamsin vaulted from the witness rail with zero court etiquette and planted herself between Sarah and the struggling attacker, feet braced like she was at a millstone lever. "You all laughed at her being unprotected," Tamsin shouted to the hall. "Look again." The attacker spat blood toward the dais. "No common dead house sits a throne." Sarah stepped around Tamsin before anyone could stop her. She stopped a few paces from the man and looked directly at him. Not at the blood, not at rope biting his wrists. "You looked at my debt and assumed I would break easily," she said. "You were wrong, and you will stay wrong." Marcus's eyes searched her face for fracture. She gave him none. Ilyan found his voice first and tried to seize procedure like a lifeline. "Right suspended pending inquiry." "No," Sarah said. Every head turned. She climbed the dais steps, one hand skimming the rail polished by generations, and stood at the vow stone. Her pulse still hammered from the attack, but her breathing had steadied. Brindle, muzzle blood smeared and proud, trotted to the base of the dais and sat, chest out, as if his position had always been assigned there. Marcus came up the opposite side slowly, as if approaching a skittish horse he refused to startle. "The stone cannot be unmade," Ilyan repeated, weaker now. Sarah placed her palm flat on the pale surface. It was cold, then warming under skin. "I heard you." She turned to Marcus. For one suspended beat, he looked less like war sovereign and more like a man standing at the edge of uncertain ground waiting to see whether it would hold his weight. She stepped forward first. Witnesses later remembered different details. Dust motes turning in the sunbeam above the stone, scrape of Marcus's boot when he shifted. The priest's voice catching once before he recovered cadence. Brindle sneezing at incense and then glaring at the nearest guard as if scent itself were suspicious. Sarah remembered texture. She remembered the grain of carved stone under her fingertips and the roughness of Marcus's skin when their hands met over the vow mark. Ilyan spoke formal words with the expression of a man being forced into his own trap in public. "By mutual assent before witness, claim stands chosen, not compelled." Sarah Vale is entered consort regent under full household authority. The title struck the hall and echoed off painted rafters. Not penalty, not remedy. Regent. Marcus repeated vow lines first, voice resonant, unhurried. "I bind no chain, I ask no kneeling. I stand with you in winter and levy, in war and harvest." Sarah answered, each word deliberate. "I offer no obedience bought by fear. I give counsel, challenge, and hand. I stand with you in winter and levy, in war and harvest." They did not kiss on command. They held each other's forearms warrior style, forehead close enough to share breath, then parted the required inch. Choice in every small motion. When the rite turned toward consummation chambers, Sarah paused at the threshold and looked once back at the hall. Brindle had already taken his place at the foot of the restored dais, as if no one had the authority to tell him otherwise. No one laughed. After the rite, the palace changed in practical ways first. Guard lines shifted under joint authority seals. Petition queues reorganized under Sarah's mark, with separate lanes for levy disputes, border claims, and household appeals, so people did not wait half a day to be told they were in the wrong line. Kitchen stores were audited and wastage cut by naming exactly which cellar bins leaked salt water and which steward had been marking spoiled grain as full stock to pad requisitions. Tithe disputes no longer sat unanswered because Sarah worked through tablets by lamplight with ink-stained fingers, and stubborn patience learned from balancing grain ledgers through flood years. Marcus did not pretend sudden softness before court. He remained blunt, sometimes frightening, often silent. But in council he began to ask, "Sarah?" before issuing border orders, and when she disagreed he listened long enough to alter plans. The first time that happened, half the chamber looked physically pained. It happened during a discussion of Spring Patrol expansion. Marcus proposed doubling mounted presence along the East Marsh Road. Sarah ran a finger down a supply table and shook her head. Feed costs and horse losses will outrun benefit in thaw mud, she said. Increase riverwatch instead. Smugglers use boats when roads dissolve. A colonel opened his mouth to object. Marcus lifted a hand for silence, scanned Sarah's numbers, and nodded. Riverwatch amended. East Marsh Patrol reduced. The colonel shut his mouth hard enough to click teeth. Ilyon remained chancellor because removing him would have broken institutional continuity during truce implementation. Sarah argued for keeping him, then clipped his discretionary powers with amendments drawn from his own codex notes. He signed with a hand tight as wire, diminished, not destroyed. Useful enough to keep, dangerous enough to watch. At one council, Ilyon attempted to delay implementation of household appeal reforms by citing staffing shortages. Sarah came prepared with a roster she had assembled from idle clerks reassigned from redundant customs counters. 6 scribes can transfer tomorrow, she said. 2 already trained in petition indexing. 1 reads Marsh dialect. 1 served under your office during famine revisions and knows the old forms. Ilyon looked trapped between refusal and public admission that his objection had been performative. Proceed, he said. She did. Tamsin stayed through settlement week, sleeping in a storage room by choice because she hated court mattresses and claimed the wool smelled like wet cat. She met merchants, hired millwright laborers, and secured grain rights for reopening the family mill beyond the East Ford. Every evening she returned to Sarah's chamber with reports, mud on her hem, triumph in her grin, and occasional bruises from bargaining elbows. You'd think buying a replacement gear wheel required blood oath, she muttered one night, peeling off damp gloves. Did you get it? Sarah asked. 2 wheels, 3 sacks of nails, and an apprentice carpenter who asks too many questions. I told him that's acceptable if he keeps his fingers out of cogs. Brindle lifted his head at the word cogs, decided this was not about food, and went back to sleep. On another evening, Tamsin spread a rough map across Sarah's table, weighted corners with cups, and pointed to the river bend. Flood cut this bank deeper. We reinforce before spring surge or we lose half the lower track. Sarah traced the line. I can spare labor from Palace stables after census day. They owe us for the oats they took in 1201. Tamsin grinned. Now you sound like Mother. Mother weaponized memory too. She did. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to rain and the scratch of Marcus's pen in the adjoining chamber as he reviewed dispatches. For once, none of it felt like borrowed ground. On the morning Tamsin departed, fog hung low over the courtyard and turned horse breath to white plumes. Carters shouted to each other through the mist. Stable hands loaded tools, flour sacks, spare axles, and the iron teeth for the mill gearing into 2 wagons bound east. Tamsin shoved a wrapped bundle into Sarah's hands, the old iron grain scoop from their father's bench, handle worn smooth by decades of palms. You'll forget to eat, Tamsin said. Use this and remember where flour starts. Sarah laughed once, then hugged her sister hard enough to creak ribs. Right. I don't write pretty. Then write ugly. Tamsin stepped back and looked her up and down as if checking for cracks. You all right? Sarah considered, then answered honestly. Not simple, but yes. Good. Tamsin scratched Brindle's neck. Keep guarding her. Brindle licked her wrist once and sneezed. Tamsin climbed into the cart, flicked reins, and called back. Don't let him brood himself into stone. I heard that, Marcus said from the stair. Good, Tamsin shouted, and rolled through the gate toward the road that led to the mill stream and a shuttered wheel waiting to turn again. Sarah stood in the fog until cartwheels faded. Marcus came down the steps and stopped beside her without speaking. She tucked the grain scoop under one arm. Brindle pressed in against both their shins, effectively tying them together until they moved. That evening, rain returned in a soft, steady curtain that blurred courtyard lamps into gold smears. Sarah sat with Marcus on the side steps of the throne hall after council had finally emptied. Her hair had escaped its pins. His coat lay folded beside him. Brindle sprawled across the threshold with one paw over the other, snoring like distant thunder. "You were right to refuse me in the circle," Marcus said. Sarah glanced at him. "I know." "You were right to force the retraction." "I know that too." A corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close. She turned the iron grain scoop in her hands, thumb tracing the worn notch near the lip. "I spent years thinking survival meant never wanting anything where anyone could see. And now? Now I can say what I want without whispering it to myself first." She leaned her shoulder into his. "Including the parts that frighten me." He exhaled, long and slow. "I can carry war. I am still learning how to carry this." "We are both learning. Sometimes badly, then less badly." He looked out at the rain-dark courtyard. "When I waited 11 years, I told myself refusal was enough, that if I did not repeat what happened in 1192, that was all required." Sarah listened. "It wasn't enough," he said. "Refusal prevented one kind of harm. It did not build anything by itself." "No," she said. "Building is slower." He turned his hand palm up on the step between them. She placed hers over it. Inside the hall, the restored dais glimmered under lamp flame, scrubbed clean of banquet spills and blood streaks. The vow stone sat pale at center, ordinary to anyone who had not stood before it with a room full of witnesses and chosen anyway. Brindle lifted his head, checked the courtyard, then dropped his chin back onto his paws with a satisfied grunt. They stayed there until the lamps burned low, speaking in starts and pauses. Supply lists, border roads, which Stewart had falsified salt tallies, whether East Ford timbers could be floated downriver before freeze, whether Tamsin would remember to hire 2 more hands before planting season. Not grand declarations, practical things that made a shared life real. When they finally rose, Brindle stood first and shook himself, spraying both of them with fine rainwater from his coat. Sarah laughed. Marcus swore softly, then laughed too. Together they went back inside.